Under the unforgiving glare of television lights, there are moments when entertainment quietly gives way to something far more unsettling. One of those moments arrived when Simon Cowell, a man known for blunt judgments and emotional restraint, paused longer than usual before speaking. The silence itself felt heavy, as if the room sensed that what was about to be said carried more weight than praise or rejection. It was not just an audition unfolding, but the opening of a story shaped by loss, restraint, and a fragile kind of hope. The man standing on that stage was Richard Goodall, someone who, until recently, lived a life almost entirely outside the spotlight. His days were defined by routine and anonymity, pushing a mop through quiet school hallways in Indiana, exchanging polite nods with teachers and students who barely knew his name. Music existed in the margins of his life, not as a career plan, but as a private refuge. When the building emptied and the echoes lingered, he would sing softly, as if testing whether his own voice could keep him company. That quiet world shattered the moment a simple phone video captured him singing and drifted onto the internet. Within days, millions of strangers were listening to a voice that had never been meant for them. The fascination was immediate, but it was not just about the sound. People sensed something unpolished and vulnerable, the feeling that this voice had been shaped by years of silence rather than years of training. Fame arrived suddenly, without warning, and with it came expectations that Richard had never prepared himself to carry. When he stepped onto the stage of America's Got Talent, his posture said as much as his singing. He stood slightly hunched, gripping the microphone as though it were an anchor. The performance was not flashy. There were no theatrics, no calculated attempts to impress. Instead, there was an intensity that felt almost accidental, as if emotion had leaked through despite his efforts to keep it contained. The audience reacted instinctively, rising to their feet, not fully sure why they were moved, but certain that they were. Yet it was Simon Cowell's reaction that shifted the atmosphere entirely. Rather than offering immediate approval, he hesitated, studying Richard with an expression that suggested concern rather than excitement. When he finally spoke, his words cut through the applause. He did not dismiss the performance, but he refused to frame it as just another impressive audition. There was an implication that something deeper was at play, something unresolved that talent alone could not explain. That implication lingered long after the applause faded. Viewers began to notice details they might otherwise have ignored. The way Richard's smile appeared briefly and then vanished. The tension in his shoulders even after receiving praise. The sense that each success brought relief rather than joy. While the narrative presented on screen was one of triumph, the emotional undertone hinted at a man struggling to reconcile opportunity with grief. What the cameras did not immediately explain was the history Richard carried with him. Long before fame found him, he had endured a profound personal loss, one that reshaped his understanding of happiness itself. Music became less about ambition and more about survival, a way to navigate days that felt heavier than they looked. Standing on a national stage did not erase that history. If anything, it threatened to expose it. As the public embraced him as a symbol of late-blooming dreams, the pressure intensified. Richard was no longer just singing for himself. He was singing for viewers who saw their own missed chances reflected in his story. Each performance became a test, not only of vocal ability, but of emotional endurance. The more he succeeded, the more fragile the balance appeared. Simon Cowell seemed acutely aware of that fragility. His comments grew increasingly careful, his tone more measured. Rather than pushing Richard toward spectacle, he appeared to be urging him toward honesty, even if that honesty came at a cost. It was a rare dynamic on a show built around competition, and it suggested that what lay ahead might not be as simple as scent. This is where the sadness quietly takes root, not in failure, but in the realization that success does not guarantee healing. Richard Goodall's journey, from overlooked janitor to celebrated performer, unfolds like a modern fairy tale on the surface. Beneath it, however, runs a current of unresolved sorrow, the kind that applause cannot drown out. Simon Cowell's acknowledgement of that truth did not confirm a scandal, but something far more human. That behind extraordinary moments often stand ordinary people carrying extraordinary pain. Long before millions of viewers began debating his future, Richard Goodall lived a life defined by predictability. His mornings began before sunrise, unlocking school doors while the town still slept, the hum of fluorescent lights greeting him before any human voice did. He knew the rhythm of the building better than anyone else, which hallway creaked, which classroom lights flickered, which corners stayed cold even in early autumn. It was a quiet existence, invisible to most, and for years he believed that invisibility was simply his place in the world. Music had once promised something different. In his younger years, Richard dreamed in melodies, imagining stages far larger than the modest rooms where he practiced. But adulthood arrived with responsibilities that left little room for ambition. Marriage, bills, routines, and the slow accumulation of compromise pushed those dreams aside. Singing became something private, almost secretive, reserved for moments when no one was listening. It was never about being discovered. It was about remembering who he was before life narrowed his choices. The most defining chapter of his past arrived without warning. His first wife's illness changed everything, reshaping his understanding of time and permanence. Hospitals replaced rehearsal spaces, and songs turned into quiet comforts whispered at bedsides. When she died, the loss did not announce itself loudly. It settled in slowly, altering the way he moved through the world. Grief became something he carried rather than confronted, folded into daily routines until it felt inseparable from them. Returning to work after her passing, Richard found solace in familiarity. The school offered structure, a place where expectations were simple and emotions rarely intruded. Students noticed his kindness, his patience, and occasionally his voice, echoing softly when he thought he was alone. Some paused to listen, others smiled and walked on, unaware that they were witnessing the remnants of a dream he no longer dared to pursue. Years passed this way, quietly, until technology disrupted the balance he had built. A brief recording, captured casually, revealed him to the outside world. Overnight, curiosity turned into admiration, and admiration into momentum. Invitations followed, including one that would alter his life entirely. Appearing on America's Got Talent was not a calculated career move. It felt more like a dare issued by fate, an opportunity that arrived too late to ignore and too suddenly to refuse. Stepping into that environment meant leaving behind the anonymity that had protected him for so long. Rehearsals replaced routine. Interviews replaced silence. He found himself recounting fragments of his past to strangers, careful to avoid the details that still hurt too much to articulate. The show demanded a narrative, something viewers could connect to, but Richard resisted being reduced to a single story of loss or triumph. His fiancée, Angie, became his anchor during this transition. She believed in his talent long before the world did, encouraging him gently but persistently. She understood that his hesitation was not fear of failure, but fear of exposure. Loving him meant accepting the parts of his history he rarely spoke about, the grief that surfaced unexpectedly, even in moments of joy. Together, they navigated a reality that neither had anticipated, balancing excitement with caution. As his performances gained attention, the contrast between his past and present grew sharper. Applause felt foreign, almost undeserved, as if he had accidentally stepped into someone else's life. Backstage, he remained reserved, watching others celebrate loudly while he processed quietly. Success, rather than lifting a weight, seemed to add new layers to it. Each round advanced not only his chances of winning, but also the intensity of scrutiny. It was during these moments that Simon Cowell appeared particularly attuned to his internal struggle. Having witnessed countless artists rise and fall, Simon recognized patterns others overlooked. He saw talent, yes, but also restraint, the way Richard held back emotionally even as his voice soared. His comments were less about competition and more about readiness, suggesting that unresolved grief could complicate even the brightest opportunity. For Richard, these observations struck close to home. They forced him to confront questions he had long avoided. Was he singing to honor the life he had lost, or to escape the pain of that loss? Could he pursue happiness without feeling disloyal to his past? The stage amplified these questions, making them impossible to ignore. Away from cameras, he remained the same man who valued simplicity. He preferred quiet meals, long drives, and familiar songs from decades earlier. Fame disrupted these comforts, introducing uncertainty where stability once lived. Even moments of triumph were accompanied by a subtle unease, the sense that something essential might slip away if he moved too fast. This background, layered with love, loss, and restraint, shaped every note he sang. It explained the depth audiences felt without fully understanding. Richard Goodall was not simply a contestant chasing a dream. He was a man negotiating with his own history, trying to determine whether success could coexist with grief or whether one would inevitably overshadow the other. As the competition progressed, the distance between Richard's past and his present began to narrow in an uncomfortable way. Each new round stripped away a layer of protection he had built over years of quiet living. The stage no longer felt like a place of discovery, but like a mirror reflecting parts of himself he had avoided for too long. The applause grew louder, the expectations heavier, and with them came a sense that something fragile was approaching a breaking point. During rehearsals, those closest to him noticed subtle changes. He practiced obsessively, repeating phrases long after others had left the room, as if precision might shield him from emotion. His voice remained powerful, but his demeanor grew more distant. Between takes, he often stared at the floor, lost in thought, while producers whispered about pacing, camera angles, and story arcs. What they saw as compelling television, Richard experienced as exposure. The pressure intensified when personal circumstances intruded on the carefully controlled environment of the show. A phone call from home, brief and heavy, reminded him that life beyond the stage had not paused for his sudden rise. Illness within his family reopened old anxieties, forcing him to weigh presence against opportunity. The idea of leaving, even temporarily, felt like betrayal to the audience that had embraced him so quickly. Staying, however, felt like abandoning responsibilities that mattered just as much. These internal conflicts began to surface during performances. One evening, as the music swelled and the crowd leaned in, Richard's voice wavered for a fleeting moment. To most viewers, it read as raw emotion, an added layer of authenticity. To him, it felt like a warning. That hesitation, barely perceptible, marked the first time he questioned whether he could continue without confronting what he carried inside. When Simon Cowell addressed him afterward, his tone was markedly different from the enthusiastic praise offered by others. He spoke carefully, acknowledging the beauty of the performance while pointing toward an unspoken tension. There was an insistence in his words, not accusatory, but probing, suggesting that talent alone would not sustain him. The audience sensed it, shifting in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing encouragement or an intervention. Online reaction followed swiftly. Social media split into camps, some celebrating Richard's vulnerability, others expressing concern. Speculation flourished. Was he overwhelmed by sudden fame? Was there a secret he had not shared? The narrative of the inspirational underdog began to fracture, revealing something more complex and less comfortable. Headlines hinted at inner turmoil, framing his journey as both uplifting and unsettling. Backstage, the atmosphere grew tense. Crew members spoke in hushed tones, mindful of microphones and cameras. Richard retreated inward, limiting conversation, conserving energy. His fiancée, Angie, became his primary point of contact with normalcy, offering reassurance that success did not require self-destruction. Their conversations, often late at night, circled the same questions without resolution. How much of his story should he tell? At what point did honesty become spectacle? Producers, sensing a pivotal moment, encouraged him to open up more on camera. They spoke of connection, of helping others through shared pain. To Richard, it felt like a demand to package grief into digestible sound bites. The idea of reducing his loss to a narrative device filled him with dread. He feared that once spoken publicly, the pain would no longer belong to him. The semi-final performance became the emotional center of this struggle. Standing alone under the lights, he sang with a restraint that bordered on collapse. Midway through the song, his voice cracked, not from lack of skill, but from the weight of memory. The crowd held its breath, unsure whether he would recover. He did, drawing on a reserve he did not know he possessed, finishing to thunderous applause. The ovation felt almost intrusive, celebrating resilience without understanding its cost. Afterward, Richard Goodall stood motionless, absorbing the noise as if from a distance. Tears surfaced briefly before he turned away. When Simon spoke again, the room fell silent. He acknowledged the rumors circulating, not by confirming gossip, but by articulating a truth many sensed but few could name. He spoke of burden, of unresolved grief, and of the danger of mistaking success for healing. That moment marked a shift. For the first time, Richard did not deflect. He nodded, visibly shaken, unable to speak. The cameras captured everything, broadcasting his vulnerability in real time. Within minutes, the clip spread online, igniting conversations far beyond the show itself. Viewers debated the ethics of such exposure, questioning whether the pursuit of authenticity had crossed a line. The aftermath was immediate and overwhelming. Journalists sought statements, fans flooded his accounts with messages of support, and critics dissected every expression. Exhausted, Richard withdrew, seeking refuge in solitude. It was there, away from the noise, that he made a decision he had long avoided. When approached by a reporter, he spoke openly about losing his first wife to cancer, admitting that he had been carrying that pain quietly for years. The confession changed the tone of the narrative overnight. Sympathy replaced speculation, and understanding tempered judgment. Simon Cowell publicly acknowledged that he had sensed this struggle from the beginning, explaining that his earlier comments were meant to protect, not provoke. His words reframed the moment, transforming it from a dramatic confrontation into an act of recognition. Yet relief did not follow as easily as expected. Sharing the truth lifted one weight, but revealed another. With his grief now public, Richard faced a new dilemma. Would he be defined by loss rather than talent? Could he continue competing without being consumed by the expectations attached to his story? As the finals approached, the tension deepened. The stage awaited, brighter and more demanding than ever. For Richard, the question was no longer whether he could win, but what winning would cost. The journey that began as a quiet chance encounter with destiny had evolved into a confrontation with his own limits. The emotional revelation did not end the storm. It only changed its direction. Once Richard's grief became public, its impact rippled outward, touching every corner of his life and the competition itself. What had once been a straightforward narrative of discovery transformed into something heavier, more contemplative, and far less predictable. The audience no longer watched him simply to be inspired. They watched with concern, measuring each performance not just for excellence, but for signs of strain. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around Richard shifted noticeably. Praise remained abundant, but it carried a different tone, softer and more cautious. Backstage, people lowered their voices when he walked past. Crew members checked in more frequently, asking whether he needed rest or space. The attention, though well-intentioned, intensified his sense of being observed. Grief, once private, now felt like something he was expected to manage publicly and responsibly. The psychological toll became evident in small, almost imperceptible ways. His routines grew rigid. Meals were skipped or forgotten. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by rehearsals and lingering thoughts. He continued to perform at a high level, but the effort behind each note increased. Singing, which once offered release, now demanded endurance. Each song reopened memories he had spent years carefully containing. For his fiancée, Angie, the shift was deeply unsettling. She watched him navigate praise and pity with equal discomfort, recognizing that neither offered true relief. In quiet conversations away from cameras, she urged him to slow down, reminding him that no competition was worth losing himself. Yet she also understood the complexity of his position. Walking away now would feel like abandoning not only a dream, but the millions who saw their own struggles reflected in his courage. The broader public reaction mirrored this complexity. Support poured in from all directions. Fans shared stories of loss, thanking Richard for articulating emotions they had never managed to express. At the same time, criticism surfaced. Some argued that the show had pushed him too far, exploiting vulnerability for ratings. Others insisted that the exposure was necessary, that honesty was part of the artistic journey. Richard found himself at the center of a debate he never intended to spark. Within this debate stood Simon Cowell, whose role evolved from evaluator to quiet guardian. His feedback became less about technique and more about balance. He spoke openly about the dangers of fame arriving before healing, emphasizing that success could amplify unresolved pain rather than resolve it. These remarks carried weight precisely because they were rare. Simon was not known for emotional caution, yet here he was urging restraint. The consequences of this guidance were complex. On one hand, Richard felt seen in a way that transcended competition. On the other, it forced him to confront a reality he could no longer postpone. The life awaiting him after the show would be louder, faster, and far less forgiving than the one he had known. Every choice now carried long-term implications. Recording contracts, tours, and interviews loomed, each promising opportunity while demanding exposure. As the weeks progressed, the cumulative effect of this pressure became visible on stage. His performances remained moving, but a subtle heaviness lingered. Audiences sensed it in the pauses between lyrics, in the way he closed his eyes slightly longer at the end of a song. What once felt like raw authenticity now carried the weight of expectation. Viewers no longer asked whether he would succeed. They asked whether he could endure. Beyond the stage, the impact extended to his hometown. Media attention descended on familiar streets, turning ordinary places into symbols of his journey. Former colleagues spoke proudly of his kindness and humility, while neighbors expressed concern about how the spotlight might change him. The community's support was genuine, but it added another layer of responsibility. Richard was no longer just representing himself. He represented resilience, perseverance, and the promise that overlooked lives could still matter. This collective investment complicated his internal struggle. In moments of solitude, he questioned whether continuing was an act of courage or obligation. The applause, once energizing, now echoed with expectation. He feared that stepping back would disappoint those who found hope in his story. Yet pressing forward risked deepening the exhaustion he felt. The show itself adapted to this tension. Producers adjusted narratives, highlighting moments of reflection alongside performances. While intended to provide context, these segments blurred the line between storytelling and intrusion. Richard cooperated, but cautiously, aware that every word could be amplified beyond his control. His desire for privacy clashed with the medium's demand for openness. Through it all, Richard Goodall remained composed outwardly, even as uncertainty tightened its grip. He continued to sing, continued to show up, continued to fulfill the role he had been cast into by circumstance. Yet the cost of doing so became increasingly apparent. Success had not erased his grief. It had illuminated it, placing it under lights too bright to ignore. By the time the competition approached its final stages, the consequences of this emotional journey were undeniable. Richard stood at a crossroads shaped not by talent or votes, but by endurance. The question was no longer whether he could win, but what kind of life awaited him once the stage lights dimmed. The answer remained uncertain, suspended between hope and exhaustion, triumph and vulnerability. Away from the roar of the audience and the constant hum of production, there existed a quieter narrative that rarely reached the screen. It unfolded in fragments, in brief moments between rehearsals, in late-night phone calls, and in habits so subtle they were easy to miss. These were the moments that revealed who Richard truly was when he was no longer performing resilience for the world. Long before cameras followed his every move, Richard Goodall had learned to survive by minimizing his needs. He was the kind of man who arrived early, left late, and never complained. At the school where he worked, teachers remembered him not for grand gestures, but for consistency. He fixed broken chairs without being asked, stayed after hours when storms flooded hallways, and listened more than he spoke. When students struggled, he offered encouragement without drawing attention to himself. This quiet generosity extended into his private life, where he often placed others' comfort above his own. Music, for him, had always been solitary. He sang not to be heard, but to steady himself. Even after gaining national attention, that instinct remained. Fellow contestants recalled seeing him hum softly backstage, eyes closed, as if trying to recreate the safety of empty corridors. He avoided dressing room chatter, preferring silence over celebration. These habits were not signs of arrogance, but of a man unused to sharing space with expectation. Those closest to him noticed how grief shaped his daily choices. He kept certain songs locked away, unwilling to perform them publicly because they carried memories too raw to expose. When producers suggested particular pieces for their emotional impact, he hesitated, weighing artistic honesty against personal boundaries. Friends described him as polite but guarded, generous yet distant. He laughed easily, but the laughter faded quickly, replaced by reflection. His fiancée, Angie, often became the bridge between his public and private selves. She saw the moments the cameras missed, the exhaustion that followed each appearance, the way his hands trembled slightly when the noise finally subsided. In conversations late at night, she reminded him of who he had been before the world began watching. Not a symbol, not an inspiration, just a man who loved music and valued peace. She worried that the narrative forming around him left little room for complexity, reducing a lifetime of experience into a single arc of triumph and pain. There were also voices from his past that rarely made headlines. Former colleagues spoke of how Richard once turned down opportunities to join local bands, not because he lacked confidence, but because he feared instability. After losing his first wife, predictability became his refuge. He needed routine to survive, structure to keep grief from overwhelming him. Fame disrupted that carefully constructed balance, introducing uncertainty at every turn. These quieter stories revealed a tension at the heart of his journey. While audiences celebrated his courage, Richard wrestled with a different reality. Courage, to him, did not mean stepping into the spotlight. It meant getting up each morning when grief made the simplest tasks feel heavy. It meant choosing kindness even when the world felt indifferent. Singing on stage was only one expression of that courage, not its origin. In rare moments of openness, he acknowledged this disconnect. He spoke of how strange it felt to be praised for vulnerability he had carried privately for years. The applause, though sincere, sometimes amplified his loneliness. People recognized his pain without fully understanding it, offering sympathy that could not replace the quiet understanding he once found in anonymity. Even Simon Cowell, whose comments often framed the larger narrative, seemed aware that something essential remained unseen. Off camera, his guidance was less about competition and more about sustainability. He warned Richard not to confuse momentum with direction, emphasizing that lasting fulfillment required more than public validation. These conversations, though private, underscored the seriousness of what was at stake. As the competition progressed, Richard's small acts of resistance became more apparent. He declined certain interviews, limited his social media presence, and insisted on moments of solitude even when schedules tightened. These choices puzzled some and frustrated others, but they were acts of self-preservation. He was not rejecting success. He was trying to shape it into something survivable. These hidden stories, layered beneath the televised narrative, complicated the image of a man transformed by opportunity. They revealed a journey not defined by sudden fame, but by decades of quiet endurance. Richard Goodall was not simply discovering his voice. He was negotiating how much of himself he could afford to give away. In this light, the sadness surrounding his rise felt less like tragedy and more like truth. The truth that dreams fulfilled do not erase history. They coexist with it, sometimes uneasily. The world saw a man standing taller under applause. Those who knew him best saw a man still learning how to stand without it. As the noise surrounding the competition slowly gave way to reflection, the meaning of Richard's journey began to shift. What remained was no reminder of rankings or trophies, but a lingering question about what truly endures after the spotlight moves on. For Richard Goodall, the experience had never been only about recognition. It had become a confrontation with time, memory, and the fragile space where pain and purpose coexist. Richard's voice, celebrated for its power and sincerity, carried something rarer than technical skill. It carried history. Each note was shaped by years of restraint, by the discipline of living quietly with grief rather than dramatizing it. Audiences responded instinctively to that authenticity, sensing that his performances were not attempts to impress, but acts of survival. In a culture often driven by spectacle, this sincerity felt almost radical. Yet the very quality that drew people to him also exposed a paradox. The world tends to reward vulnerability without fully understanding its cost. Richard's openness resonated precisely because it reflected truths many preferred not to face in their own lives. Loss does not end neatly. Healing does not follow a schedule. Success does not erase absence. By standing on stage and singing through that reality, Richard became a mirror rather than a fantasy. This is where the idea of legacy quietly emerges. Legacy is often framed in terms of achievement, titles won, records broken, moments preserved in highlight reels. Richard's legacy, however, seemed to form along a different axis. It lived in the permission he gave others to acknowledge unfinished grief. It lived in the reminder that dignity can exist without closure, and that continuing forward does not require forgetting what came before. Even Simon Cowell, whose career has been built on identifying marketable success, appeared to recognize this distinction. His comments increasingly emphasized balance rather than ambition, peace rather than momentum. He spoke not as a judge seeking the next star, but as someone who understood how easily triumph can become hollow if it demands too much. In doing so, he reframed the narrative from competition to consequence. Richard himself seemed to grapple with these ideas in moments of quiet honesty. Away from cameras, he acknowledged that the applause, while meaningful, could not replace the simple comforts he once relied on. Familiar routines, small communities, and unremarkable days had sustained him when grief was most acute. The question he now faced was whether he could carry those values into a life shaped by attention and expectation. This tension between visibility and peace defined the latter stages of his journey. He no longer sang merely to prove himself. He sang to reconcile opposing forces within him, gratitude and exhaustion, hope and sorrow. In doing so, he challenged a common assumption about success. That assumption suggests that once opportunity arrives, all doubts should dissolve. Richard's story quietly dismantled that notion, revealing that opportunity can amplify uncertainty just as easily as it amplifies joy. What endured most powerfully was not a single performance, but the emotional honesty threaded through them all. Viewers who followed his journey did not simply witness talent. They witnessed a man refusing to pretend that victory equaled resolution. This refusal, subtle yet firm, became his most lasting statement. In the broader cultural landscape, Richard's experience offered an understated lesson. It suggested that fulfillment is not found in replacing one identity with another, but in integrating them. The janitor and the performer were never separate selves. They were chapters of the same life, shaped by circumstance rather than hierarchy. Recognizing that continuity allowed Richard to see his past not as something to escape, but as something to honor. As discussions of his future continued, speculation mattered less than impact. Regardless of the paths he chose next, his presence had already altered the way many people understood resilience. He demonstrated that strength does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appears in persistence, in showing up even when the outcome remains uncertain. In this sense, Richard Goodall's story does not resolve into a clean conclusion. It remains open, defined by questions rather than answers. Perhaps that is its greatest value. It resists the temptation to simplify human experience in a triumph or tragedy. Instead, it acknowledges the complexity of living with both. As the final echoes of applause faded, what remained was not the noise of victory, but a quiet reckoning. The cameras captured celebration, confetti, and smiling faces, yet beneath the spectacle lingered an uncertainty that no trophy could resolve. For Richard Goodall, the end of the competition did not feel like an ending at all. It felt like a pause, a breath taken at the edge of something unknown. Winning changed his circumstances, but did not rewrite his inner landscape. In the days that followed, he moved through interviews and appearances with polite gratitude, offering measured smiles while guarding the parts of himself that felt most fragile. The world saw a champion. Richard felt like a man still learning how to live with everything that had surfaced along the way. Success had opened doors, yet it also demanded choices he had never imagined making. Returning home provided a momentary sense of grounding. Familiar streets, familiar faces, and the school halls he once cleaned welcomed him without expectation. Among people who knew him before the spotlight, he could speak plainly. He admitted that the journey had taught him something difficult to accept. Healing and happiness are not the same, and they do not always arrive together. This understanding did not diminish his gratitude. It deepened it. Public response continued to pour in, messages from strangers who found pieces of themselves in his story. Some thanked him for giving voice to grief they had long suppressed. Others urged him to protect his peace, to step back if the weight became too heavy. Richard read these messages quietly, absorbing them without responding publicly. He understood now that inspiration can be both a gift and a burden. In the background, Simon Cowell remained a steady presence, offering counsel without pressure. Their conversations, no longer framed by competition, centered on sustainability. Simon spoke candidly about the cost of relentless visibility, reminding Richard that stepping away from the spotlight could be an act of strength rather than surrender. The advice carried a tone of respect, acknowledging that success measured only by momentum often comes at too high a price. Richard faced a choice that could not be crowdsourced. Opportunities lined up before him, each promising validation and reach. Yet he weighed them against something less tangible but more urgent: peace. He began to consider a future where music remained central but not consuming, where singing could exist alongside quiet mornings and unremarkable days. The idea of balance, once abstract, now felt essential. This closing chapter does not offer a tidy resolution. There is no definitive answer to what Richard Goodall will become. That uncertainty, however, is precisely what makes his story resonate. It refuses the familiar arc where triumph erases pain and replaces it with certainty. Instead, it acknowledges that growth often leaves questions intact. What he leaves behind is not simply a record of performances, but a shift in how success can be understood. He demonstrated that vulnerability does not require spectacle, that dignity can persist even when emotions remain unresolved. His journey challenged the assumption that the goal of achievement is closure. Sometimes the goal is simply continuation, moving forward with greater honesty than before. For those who followed his path, the lasting impression is not sadness alone. It is recognition. Recognition that ordinary lives contain extraordinary depth. Recognition that talent can emerge late and still matter. Recognition that grief, when acknowledged, does not weaken a person, but clarifies what truly deserves protection. As the lights dim and attention moves elsewhere, Richard carries with him a quieter kind of victory. He has reclaimed his voice not just as a performer, but as a person. Whether he chooses grand stages or small rooms, his singing now holds a different purpose. It is no longer about being seen. It is about being whole. And perhaps that is where this story belongs, not at the height of applause, but in the space that follows. A space where questions remain open, where healing continues imperfectly, and where a man who once lived unnoticed has learned that visibility is only meaningful if it does not cost him himself.